Thanks everybody for coming to the Catalonia House, and we're very happy today. This is the launching of our series that we call the Catalonia House Conversations. It's a series of events, of panels, of discussions that we're going to have portraying the best that Catalonia has, to let our partners know what's happening back home, and also things that are of interest, mutual interest. Today we're very happy to host you here. As you know, this is a beautiful room for those that don't know the story. This is one of the few houses that survived the Great Fire of London. So this is actually an original. This is actually all original, like the paneling and the ceiling. So we are very fortunate to be able to be in this building. You saw also the facade. This is a beautiful thing. This belongs to the city of London, and we rented, so I think Catalonia has all this money to just buy beautiful buildings around the world. So anyway, welcome to the Catalonia House. First of all, I want to acknowledge this what we call the Catalonia House Conversations. It's a joint effort of all the institutions that are housed in this. In this house. So we have 5 different agencies, if you want, of the Catalan government represented here, which are working together to have this, idea of unity and coordination about the external representation of Catalonia, what we do to serve our people, to serve the interests of Catalonia, but also to build bridges with partners in the UK and Ireland. So we have an agency called Acció, which is Trade and Investment Office, and we have the director here, Oscar. And also these events are so that you can know each other and then chat, and who knows what may appear. We also have the Catalan Tourist Board. This is a very important market for us. There's 2 million British people going to Catalonia every year. The director here, Aquest, Also, we have ISEG, which is the agency of the Catalan Agency for Cultural Industries. So that's business with theater and music and groups. And we have the director, Marc Pérez, in here. And we have the Institut Ramon Llull, which is Catalan Culture and Language. And we have the director, Marc Dueñas, and I want to especially thank Marc for this event, because actually this happened because he put all of us together. This is a literary and academic event, so it's the side of the house that Marc deals with, and we'll do other areas. So this is Marc's areas. And for those that don't know me, my name is Francesc. I'm the head of the delegation here in the Catalonia House of the government. So thank you everybody for coming. I had a sort of speech written which makes no sense anymore because I already told most of what I wanted. The idea, again, and I finish with this, the idea that these conversations have is just really to put forward who we are, what's happening back home. We're going to have things like the startup law in Catalonia, so that we can tell investment people and banking people and business people what's happening in back home. We're going to have issues related to language policies with Catalan, with Welsh, with Irish. What's the policy of a language, what we can learn from each other. We're going to have things related to advanced therapies with people from the biomedical science, so that we can also spur some interest in terms of investment, etc. We're going to have things related to renewable energies, which is a big topic. And as you know, Catalonia is really investing a lot, both economically but also politically, in renewable energies. So we're going to do this to portray the best that we have to offer, but also to connect with possible, with partners, and so that you are all informed of what happens. But we have the vocation that we have in the delegation, and also the different agencies, is to serve as a focal point for information, a focal point for issues of, especially Acció, I would say, in terms of business, but also in terms of tourism. So before going to the panel, of course, I want to thank the 3 of them for being here. Elisenda is the professor of Catalan, but also the president of the Anglo-Catalan Society. So we thought there would be no better way to inaugurate, to start these conversations with someone that embodies really this bridge between Catalonia and in the UK. And then we have the authors that, Elisenda will, I won't dwell into your bios because Elisenda will do that, but I would like to thank you both very, very much for coming here. These are very interesting books, and what we thought would be a good idea to start with, because these are British people writing about Catalan history. So again, this is about their work, it's about their ideas, and we hope we'll have a debate based on their work. It's nobody's point of view, but their own. A couple of housekeeping announcements before I start. You saw a camera there, so you know that this is going to be recorded, just in case. We have to say that there's a notice in the entrance to comply with all legal requirements. We have some books in here, the books that the authors wrote. So after the session, of course, these are for purchase, and we'll deal directly with the authors. Also, let us know if you want to be in our mailing list, so coming conversations, we can inform you. And finally, you saw some empty glasses outside. They're not going to remain empty. So after that, we'd like you to join us for a glass of cava and a little snack to celebrate the launching. It's not going to happen every session, because we also have a very limited budget, but today is the launching, so we thought it was a cause for celebration. So without further ado, Elisenda, thank you so much. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and obviously thanks for the invitation today. And yes, I will be moving, so I hope you can hear well. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce the speakers today, Michael Eaude and Andrew Dowling, who will talk about the books we have here, as Cecilia just said. And it is obviously on the fascinating topic of Catalan history. So Michael is, as you know, is a writer, a journalist, has written. Okay, thank you. I suppose that you can hear me. It's quite a nice. It's a beautiful room, actually. So yes. So Michael is a writer and a journalist. Has written several books on Catalunya, Barcelona, and the Països Catalans. His several books include Catalonia, A Cultural History, and Stairs and Wings on the history, politics, and culture of Valencia. He's written hundreds of articles for the British press and Spanish press and on Catalan also culture. And he has lived in Barcelona and Valencia as well, am I correct? Since the 90s. Okay. 1990. So if you allow me, I will introduce also Andrew. Andrew Dowling is a reader in Spanish history at Cardiff University. Researches the history and politics of Catalonia. It's been publishing for decades now, I mean, on Catalan history in the 20th century, particularly on the political articulation of Catalan nationalism and the rules of Franco dictatorship and democratic Spain. He has previously, before this book came, he has published The Rise of Catalan Independence, Spain's Territorial Crisis, and Catalonia since the Spanish Civil War, Reconstructing the Nation in 2012. Andrew also lived a while ago, particularly in Barcelona, for about 7 years. Mm-hmm. So it's, as I said, it is a pleasure to have these excellent books here, especially because there were several years without a book written on Catalan culture, literature, sort of. Literatures because they are from literature. So, nothing happens. I was saying that, yes, that it's a pleasure to have these books on history today, because it's been decades without a book written in English on Catalan history. The last one was, and Andrew kindly wrote it today, it was The Catalans by John Reed, right? I don't know if you know this book. That was in 1978. So it's quite a while ago. And it's very interesting to have these books today. But it's also very curious, let's say it that way, that these two books appeared in less than 1 year. I mean, both books.
1 month.
1 month. Less than 1 month. So the authors weren't aware that they were writing on the same topic simultaneously until they saw the books on the public domain. So I think that this is a very interesting fact on how creative processes really interact in a way. So I'm going to open just a discussion today with a very general question. Basically, why this project? After a while, as I said, without having definitely a reason, basically. So why did you start the project, Andrew, for example, if you want to start? What kind of aspects would you like to emphasize that former books didn't?
Okay. I'll try and be as brief as I can, but I think one thing, I wrote a book on Catalan independence which came out in the summer of 2017, so obviously just before everything really kicked off, and in a way that had sort of exhausted me, and reflects all of the changes in how we write history over the past 40, 50 years. This is, it's very readable, very accessible book. There's still plenty of value in it, but it's very much a book of its time. It's very much kind of focused on monarchs and kings and queens, and it's that school of history. So one thing I think it was thinking that we need a new perspective on Catalan history. Then what really permitted me to do the book was COVID, and I'm not going to say too much about COVID, but lockdown meant I could no longer kind of obviously go to Barcelona or go to Catalonia or go to archives, and I just decided that I would try and tackle this project and attempt to write a history of Catalonia, and I rapidly discovered, because as Elisenda's mentioned, I'm a specialist on the 20th century, so initially I thought, well, I'll go right back to the Romans and bring it right up to the present. I rapidly discovered that actually I barely know anything about the Roman period. So the whole project took a lot longer than I thought, because I wanted to be fairly confident that if a kind of Romanist or a medieval historian in Catalonia looked at it, they wouldn't say, this is absolute garbage. I had to make it kind of like solid and rigorous about all the other time periods as I possibly could, as I was fairly confident I could do for the 20th century. So that's sort of the story behind how my book came about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Michael, would you like to answer this?
Well, mine is, the motivation is political, really, because this series, The People's History, you probably know this, but People's Histories is one of the Russian Revolution, one of the Portuguese Revolution, 1974, was a people's history of the French Revolution. There's a people history of the United States, which I think was the original one by Howard Zinn. So although it's not a formal series, it's an informal series of people's histories. And they're very much books which are written, as Andrew has commented on his, they're written from the bottom up, so to speak, written about the struggles of workers and peasants rather than about more formal politics or kings and queens. The main difficulty is similar to Andrew's. I mean, no serious historian, I'm not a serious historian at all, but no one, Andrew is at least a serious historian about one period. But I mean, you start writing about the 13th century and you come across references to Jewish presence in Catalonia. I knew nothing at all about Jewish presence in Catalonia. So what do? You read a few books and you put them together. So it's not actually, in my view, a historian is someone who goes and does some good, solid, archival research or interviews people, a bit contemporary, talks to people. And what I've done is read as many books as you can, which sometimes is not as much as one would want to, and put it together. But the point is that you put it together from a particular perspective, and for me, this is a political book. It wouldn't have got published without Pluto, which is a left-wing publisher, would not have been a slightest bit interested in this if it hadn't been for the Catalan independence movement leading up to 2017. I thought of doing something like this in about 2010, 2011, and no one knew anything about Catalonia except for George Orwell and his homage to Catalonia, because it doesn't even take place, most of it in Catalonia. So it was only with 2017 that became viable, and that's the story. One's own motivation, I don't know, I wanted to write a political book, really, about Catalonia.
Mhm.
I probably haven't answered the question at all.
No, I mean, there's a clear political motive as well. So that links to the question I want to ask you both. It is also related to the purposes behind the books. And you have tackled the core, I mean, the essential beliefs that have built nations over the decades. You address questions like what we do explain about ourselves, how we create narrative about the people and the nation. So would you say that one purpose might be, perhaps the main one, is debunking or just questioning historical myths?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I think, for me personally, like mine is not a partisan intervention. Okay, it's not intended to be. It attempts, if it's anything, to be what I would consider hopefully a fairly solid, rigorous historical account. And sort of reflecting Elisenda as an expert on literature, for example, and I think it's really important in the discipline of history that we apply the same levels of scholarly rigour to the analysis of history as we would to the analysis of literature. But we all know that history is a battleground. History, is highly intervened politically. British politicians, Conservative governments since 2010 have been trying to intervene in the history curriculum, want to tell a positive story about the British Empire. We should be proud about British Empire. So ideally, we kind of try to achieve that, but equally, I don't believe there's such a thing as a neutral observer. Okay, all of us, or all historians, we all come at things from a certain perspective, and I do not believe there is such a thing as kind of like objective neutral history. I do not believe that is possible either. But I do think, and I say it on occasion in the book, I say things like, for example, maybe there's not a Catalan state by any meaningful terms in the 11th century, but there wasn't one anywhere. And I always emphasise that the kind of criticisms that you can make about Catalan history can equally apply to kind of England or Poland or kind of Scotland or Ireland. I come from an Irish background, my parents are Irish. One Irish historical narrative is 800 years of English oppression, okay? Now, if you spend a little bit of time analysing Irish history, you can see that actually you're probably talking about 400 years of English oppression. Doesn't mean there isn't English oppression, but you just have to be precise in your rigour, precise in your terminology, precise in how you analyse and how you interpret the data. And I think, and I'm very happy to be sort of pressed on this, I think I would have written the same book if I was writing about Ireland, Scotland, Wales, France, Spain, Poland, Bulgaria. I would have tried to use the same methodology, the same approach, the same interrogation of the data, the same interpretation of the interpretations that have been given to Catalan history as I would for anywhere else. So I think I try to make my book fair. I don't say that that Catalan history is artificial and they have no claim to nation. I start off very much in the beginning that by any definition of nation, Catalonia clearly is a nation, and therefore we can analyse it in the same way as we would French or English history. I mean, it just so happens that in the present it's not a state. It doesn't have a state to sort of instill a certain perspective, but that's a separate issue, and that's what I've tried overall to try to achieve as a kind of rigour, but it's not a partisan intervention in that sense.
Thank you. That's very interesting about the objectivity and the neutrality of the book and how the methodology is applied. And regarding the methods, you were coming from a different kind of let's say, yes, education. I don't know. I mean, it's as you mentioned, it's not like a rigor. I mean, historian per se. So, how it is your approach? How is your method? Because it's did you go to the archive? How did you do that?
No, I didn't go to any archives. I think.
Nor did I.
You didn't.
No. No, mine is
But you're an academic. You have to.
No, I know, but it was COVID. It's all secondary literature.
Right. Well, that's what it is. I mean, I can share with Andrew exactly what he said. You obviously have to be as rigorous as you can. I've made. I mean, this book's been out for 3 or 4 months, and already 3 or 4 people have told me about tremendous mistakes in it, and this is what happens. And omissions, incredible omissions, because as I said at the beginning, in 1,000 years you can't know everything about it at all. Yeah, I mean, to answer you directly, I have interviewed people. I think in the past 40 years, I mean, I was lucky with the Civil War, for instance. I know very well a lot of Civil War historians. I also knew people who fought in the Civil War. I've known people active in the transition against NATO. So for the last 40, 50 or 70, 80 years, I feel I've got first-hand knowledge. Everything else is second-hand. But coming back to the national question, which I imagine we'll talk about a lot today, I agree, Catalonia is clearly a nation. And clearly you can't talk, as I have heard some Catalan nationalists say, you can't talk about Catalonia in the 12th century as a nation, but as Pierre Vilar, who was an important French historian of Catalonia, explained, as much as any other place, and he says more than any other place, Catalonia had a certain identity in the 12th, 13th century, but one can almost use the anachronism of it being a nation or a national entity, even though you know it's not a nation. Nations were, the word nation began to be bandied about in the 19th century. It comes up with the Romantic movement, the French Enlightenment, the dawn of capitalism and nation states. And Spain, for instance, the Spanish state, wrote its historical myths in the 19th century about how it is fought for 700 years to expel the Moors, and how I've heard José María Aznar, who you may have heard of, he used to be the Prime Minister of Spain. I've heard Aznar say that Spain is 2,000 years old. I mean, Spain is not 2,000 years old, and Catalonia isn't either. So at the same time as Spain was writing its national myths, then Catalonia, perhaps we shouldn't go into this right now, but Catalonia also wrote some national myths. And I hope that, well, I know that I've tried to express some of those. I don't know if you want to go into that now, Elisenda, or we'll go into that later on about national myths.
Everything we can. I mean,
everything all at once.
No, because you're right. I was changing orders. So because what you just said now, it's very interesting, especially about how we do, for example, when they are building, when the nations have been constructed in a way, and how we really cope with that bloody history that all nations have behind. And this is for you, Michael, because it's something that we mentioned before, and I found it in the book as well. And it is the idea that if you think that Catalan nationalist historians laid down the massacres in the expansion that you were mentioning now phase in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Yeah, I don't think it's controversial, and this is part of what Andrew is saying about putting in a bit of rigor in the book. You know, I'm not a nationalist. I'm not I've always said I'm an internationalist. So some people, when they say internationalist, use that to attack Catalan nationalism. But I think if you're talking about an oppressed nation, or a nation whose nationalism is reactive to a greater nationalism, then an internationalist ought to be supporting that oppressed nation. Doesn't mean you're a nationalist itself. Lots of nationalist myths. I mean, I learned a little Catalan I know listening to TV3 and Jordi Pujol, who was president of Catalonia in the 1990s, talking about how Catalans were dedicated to pacting. That's the Catalans, or as if it's in the DNA of Catalans, that they like pacting with people. Well, I mean, I'm sure Catalans sometimes like pacting and sometimes they like hitting you on the nose. And when reading Catalan nationalist historians, there's one that's come to mind. It's not to be rude about it, but Ferran Soldevila, who I read quite a lot, talks about the invasion, for instance, of Mallorca from Catalonia in 1230, something like that, 1231. And he talks about how the nation, the Catalan nation, its language, its culture expanded. And nowadays, of course, Mallorca, everyone there talks in Catalan, and it's part of the greater Catalonia, and so forth. And he completely omits the fact that in extremely badly organized and bloody war, the previous inhabitants of Mallorca were slaughtered or expelled. So Catalan imperialism, which in the expansion of the 12th and 13th century spread right across the Mediterranean, it reached Athens. Athens was a Catalan possession in, I can't remember the dates, but it was a Catalan possession for about 70 years. And this was not done by pacting. I don't think that people in Athens really wanted to pact the imperialists turning up and slaughtering them. And can I go on or should I stop? And there's a particular character who I've always enjoyed because I used to know someone who lived on a street called Roger de Flor in the centre of Barcelona. And I thought, all the streets in the centre of Barcelona, the Eixample, which is the modernist expansion of Barcelona, they're all named after famous Catalan characters. And I found out, reading a little bit about Roger de Flor, that he'd never been to Catalonia. He was a minor German nobleman living in southern Italy who was bankrupt. And if you're a nobleman and you have any money, then what you do is you organise an army and you go to war. And to cut a long story short, he led the Catalan gangs of warriors from Sicily, which was Catalan possession at the time, to conquer or to fight on behalf of the Emperor of Constantinople against the Moors, against the Turks. And he was a thoroughly disreputable character. I mean, he had fought earlier with the Templars, and he'd been expelled from the Templar order because he stole from the people he was saving from the Turkish attacks in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So these people, it's obvious, I'm going on too long. Any imperialism, any expansion is with blood and slaughter. And that's what's happened with Catalonia. Which is not to say that there wasn't a lot of pacting going on, which is another theme between the Count of Barcelona, who was the monarch of Barcelona, and the upper class, with the prelates, with the nobles, with the military, and so forth. So one just has to nuance a bit that it's not that Catalans are better or worse than anyone else, it's just that there is a specific history which has to be drawn out.
After Jordi Pujol, the regional president of Catalonia, Michael Eaude, I think in an interview in 2012, he said that the Catalans are different from the Spaniards because we were under Charlemagne, so it's like we have some kind of Germanic, Carolingian heritage. So what does that tell us? It tells us firstly how politicians use history. You know, use the construction of history, use historical narratives, and and people can say and believe what they want. It's just not historically accurate. And I think it's actually a really good point that Mike's just made, that the Catalans, and I think that's a really excellent way of framing it, are neither better nor worse than any other say European people. How about that as a kind of like, as a framing device, okay? That you can find in Catalan history plenty of dark, negative episodes, and you can find lots to be kind of like really proud about. And you know, you go around the world, and you know, I've travelled haven't been to every country, but I've heard from any nationality in the world that say the Turks or the Bulgarians or the Polish, we're the best people in the world. And I've certainly, when I lived in Catalonia, I met plenty of Catalans who say Catalonia is the best country in the world. And I'm not saying that you're not allowed to think that, and that thought should be prohibited or forbidden, but you just cannot make a valid claim about that. Plus, if that's what you want to believe, that the Catalans are the best people in the world, that's fine. But you probably need to ask yourself, why do you need to believe that? You know, wherever you are, whatever is your national background. And I think, you know, like I said earlier, I wanted to be fair to Catalan history. Walking around London today, I'm reminded of plenty of things. Westminster Abbey, you know, the tombs of pretty ruthless British monarchs. If you go into Westminster Abbey, you will see a whole series of giant British imperial and military flags held there. If I went to university in Canterbury, and in Canterbury Cathedral is the tomb of the Black Prince. Now, if you know anything about European history, you will know that the Black Prince, you could not find a more vicious, ruthless, kind of medieval killer who rampaged through France. And he's given a kind of holy shrine in sort of British historical memory. And you can do that with Catalonia. You can, you know, I think we should be able to say that some of the wealth that facilitated Catalan capitalism in the 19th century came from the Cuban slave trade. That's not opinion. That's not opinion. That can be verified by empirical data. And we should be able to talk about that. We know that these things are happening everywhere. Kick down statues, tear down statues, pull down Colston. Some of these debates are also happening in the city of Barcelona. Barcelona is still very behind, I would say, in coming to terms with the heritage of slavery and its impact and its contribution to Catalan capitalism, to the Catalan economy. I think we should be able to try to tell the truth. I don't think it's anti-Catalan or anti-any nationality in the world to say this is what really happened during your history, but we know that certain people, you know, look at America, how it's so partisan, divided about narratives of who is American or what happened in American history, or slavery, or, you know, the slaughter of native peoples. We have to be able to talk about these things. We have to be able to talk about the violence of Catalan imperialism in the Middle Ages. It's not anti-Catalan to talk about those things. That's probably enough from me. But.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. So this is also linking with you mentioned the baptism, but also the books. Both books are a part of adjectives, expressions saying that Catalan people are rebellious. Catalan people protest all the time. They are fighting. They are struggling. They are trying to advance. So I have underlined loads of expressions from your book about rebellious people, etc. So my question clearly is just if you think that Catalans are particularly rebellious people?
Yes, but I think there are two. Yes, they are. There's plenty of evidence in Catalan history of rebellions, but there are also, and I think this is where we should also remind ourselves, because I know it says much more and goes into much more detail about the rebellions of the left, if you want.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we also recall and remind ourselves that in the 19th century, Catalonia was an exceptional society in terms of the Carlist rebellions. So you can be rebellious, you can be a protesting people, but you can also rebel for very conservative, very reactionary ends. And I think, you know, it's very important to situate 3 Carlist wars, the revolt of the malcontents in 1827. We mustn't forget that there are rebellions of the right as well. Okay, there is kind of reactionary violence. You know, some of these Carlist wars are extremely violent. Okay, and that's, you know, Catalonia over the course of the 19th century is a battleground around political ideologies. It's a battleground around ideas of the church and anti-clericalism. It's a battleground between sort of workers, between peasants and landowners, and workers and bosses. And Catalonia has one of the strongest reactionary political movements in Europe over the course of the 19th century. Carlism is a mass movement of political reaction. Visca el rey, long live the king, you know. Visca España, long live Spain. Visca els furs, long live our traditional rights and privileges. And it's a very strange, very unusual political formation, but it does produce rebellions, and I think we have to see Catalan history in the round and include Carlism as one manifestation of that rebellious history.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Andrew. Would you like to add about values, people, and particularly you praised obviously the anarchists as well, and the Catalan working class, why they were so famously militant in the 19th century, for example?
Yeah, I don't think the Catalans as such, especially rebellious, probably in trying to maintain an identity or an autonomy, or more recently advanced towards independence. They've been obliged against, they're sandwiched between two strong states, a very, very highly centralized French state and a Spanish state which is much weaker, which has never actually properly centralized its state, not even today, in a way that the French have been able to. And the pressure on Catalonia, right through the main dates of Catalan history, 1640-41, when first the Spanish tried to reduce Catalonia, and then the French, who were allies of Catalonia because there was a 30 Years' War going on, then also reduced Catalonia. 1714, when the Bourbons, in the famous siege of Barcelona, reduced Catalonia and abolished all the traditional constitutions of Catalonia, and 1939, which most people know when Franco defeated Catalonia. So I think rebellious is because in each generation there's been a defense against attempts to unify a Spanish state, which the Spanish state based on Castile has not been able to do. So I think it is rebellious people, but it's not because they were born rebellious.
It's not in the DNA.
I was going to say that, but I thought I said it before, so I've got to leave it out. And so, yeah, it is rebellious people. On Carlism, I think Carlism is something which we've all probably grappled to get to grips with. Carlism is a mass movement in the 19th century based on the peasantry, based on religious fervour. It came to some degree out of the Napoleonic Wars, when after the French Revolution, which was a revolution which transformed the world, certainly transformed France in the name of freedom, liberty, atheism, the reaction to that in Spain was extremely, in the Spanish state, was extremely contradictory, and in Catalonia the same. There were people who supported what the French Revolution was wanting to do, but didn't like the idea of Napoleon then invading the Spanish state or Catalonia. And there were people who saw that Napoleon was the devil, and they used to fight many people in Catalonia, fought Napoleon, fought the French Revolution in the name of God, in the name of not a free Catalonia, but in the name of a Spanish absolutist king, Fernando VII, who was the last absolutist king of Spain right up to 1833, but fought in his name, not for any free Catalonia. So I think that precedes the Carlist Wars, which came later in 1833 and 1840, when the brother of Fernando VII didn't accept that his heir was his daughter, with his wife as the regent, and started the Carlist Wars. And I think the Carlist Wars is all about the dawning of capitalism as well. It's about, you had an incredible situation. You had in a place like Barcelona in 1835, say, you had the first steam-driven factories, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and because it's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the proletariat, beginning of a working class, responding to that, organising itself, rebelling. At the same time, maybe just 30, 40 kilometres away, you had these ultra-reactionary religious fanatics in the name of Don Carlos. Can you say that? Religious fanatics in the name of Don Carlos fighting the Spanish state. And it's so contradictory because the Spanish state, of course, was not defending a dawning Catalan industry because it was based on the military, on big landowners, on the king and the court in Madrid. And Spanish capitalism didn't exist apart from in Catalonia and beginning in Basque Country, Valencia, but first of all in Catalonia in the 1830s. And so the Carlist Wars is not separated from that. It was a phrase of Joaquin, to finish, Elisenda, sorry to go on, but it was a phrase of Joaquin Marin, who was a leader of the PAUM in the Spanish Civil War, of the anti-Stalinist left. And Marin talks about the Carlists, and what he says is the Carlist is, it was strong Carlism in the Basque Country and in Catalonia. And he says it was a deformed sort of struggle in defense of national independence, because Don Carlos the Pretender, was not anyone who wanted to restore Catalan freedoms, but he made out he was out to restore Catalan freedoms. And it was a distorted fight to, I can't find the words, but I think I said it already. It was a distorted sort of response to the rise of capitalism and the fact that what was happening was not not benefiting them in the countryside. I haven't expressed that at all well, but Andrew, who's a real historian, I'm sure he can say it better.
No, you did it very well. But I wanted to add something. That you mentioned the contradictions within the Carlist Wars, and this is for you, Andrew, as well. Does this contradict the nationalist image of Catalonia as a progressive nation?
It's a little bit of a strange question. I don't really know. I'm not sure that anyone has, or I've ever encountered anyone say that Catalonia is a progressive nation. So what are you asking me there?
Okay.
It's not something. It's not something I'm familiar with. I don't know what that means.
No, because it is about the image of, and you mentioned it in the book, that is the democratic tradition.
Okay.
Let's say,
Yeah.
if we kind of like contrast with other kind of nationalism, the image. We are talking about images, not about reality.
Okay.
Right? So that was that kind of image that Catalonia has been a democratic in history, etc. And then, most recently, Carlism has been used against, for example, the independence movement. For example, that those kind of associations with this task were made by some Spanish nationalists. So
Right.
I'm going through that kind of like links.
Okay. Well, I suppose what I'm probably thinking there then is, I'm not aware that the Catalans are necessarily particularly, progressive people. Again, it's it's not in your DNA, and I'm sort of reminded about some of my early studies were on Catalan Catholicism. There's a great line, not a great line really, but there's a great line from Josep Torres y Bages, who said that there is no people as Christian as the Catalans, and there's a whole series of other great one-liners talking about how the role of the father is to be the patriarch of the family, how we were given our family structure with Adam and Eve, and you could go on and on and on. So there's a very strong conservative tradition in Catalonia, and I've even heard it said that one way of sort of defining Jordi Pujol was, sort of as a Carlist, a Carlist to the king, his relationship with King Juan Carlos, the Fours, which was basically kind of autonomous legislation, and law and order and a whole series of traditional values. So I think clearly, to answer a question like that, you'd have to kind of go into depth. What are the values of the Catalans? And I think, what are the values of the rest of Spain? and I wouldn't necessarily see that much difference in terms of social values. I'm not anti-Spanish or something like that. I think there's lots of kind of particularly young people, the under 40s, say in Spain today, I think most Spaniards today in the under 40s are very young, very open, very tolerant, very progressive, like most of the students I teach in their 20s. There may be differences of opinion on that, but you can get kind of like strongly conservative cohorts in Catalonia, just like you can, you know, Kim Torra or Isabel Ayuso, for me, they're both kind of like right-wing conservatives. I mean, and you can say, oh, that's really unfair because Kim Torra comes from a small people and Isabel Ayuso comes from a dominant people. But I think by any sort of definition in political science, you would have to say that those two individuals are kind of like right-wing conservatives. And, you know, I'm happy to sort of go into great depth. So, are the Catalans progressive? It's not really a kind of category that means much to me. I know that kind of, we tell each other stories, okay, that would be a different, so Catalans like to think, or you would encounter Catalans who say, we are progressive, we are a kind of an open, tolerant people, and that is a story they tell themselves, because that's the story they need to tell themselves in contrast to a Spain they construct that is kind of Francoist, that is intolerant, that is fanatical, and so therefore the message we have to tell ourselves is that we are open and plural and tolerant, okay? But, you know, there's more to Spanish political life than Francoism. Francoism is kind of one aspect of Spain's political history. Spain has a very strong progressive history. Spain has a very strong Republican history, you know? In fact, just to leave it there, I would say, going back to sort of my thoughts on Carlism, I would say for most of the 19th century, Catalan conservatives are more fanatical, using that word, than many on the Spanish right over the course of the 19th century. There you go, there's something to throw out there. That changes in the 20th century, of course it changes in the 20th century, but Carlism is an extremely kind of reactionary ideology. It really is. I mean, and you know, that doesn't exist in the rest of Spain. Spanish conservatives are deeply divided around different factions over the course of the 19th century. Carlism is one manifestation of conservatism, and it's overwhelmingly centred, as has been mentioned, in the Basque Country and in Catalonia. It barely exists in the rest of Spain. There are other kind of ideologies kind of around, and there, you know, who wrote the book El Liberalism es un pecado? Liberalism is a sin. Who wrote that book? Anybody?
I don't know.
It was Felix Sardà, a Catalan theologian, okay, in 1870. Very strong conservative Catalan tradition, and that carries on into the 1930s. You know, the Liga, etc., etc. You know, is Jordi Pujol a socially progressive individual? Probably not. Pass on to Michael.
Yeah, I don't think. The only thing I'd say, to be brief this time, is that an oppressed people, I think, fighting for its rights in particular situations, it tends to radicalise the politics of the place where it's fighting. And I think one can see in the Spanish Civil War at certain particular times, in the recent independence struggles, you can see the whole society moving to the left, which doesn't mean everyone in the society moves to the left, but it means that there is overall a more progressive move. I think that's quite different, if I haven't expressed it well, from saying that it's more democratic. I mean, that's a self-image, as Andrew has explained quite well. But I think these big struggles to defend Catalonia against, especially the Spanish state, does radicalise wide swathes of the population. And yeah, Jordi Pujol is extremely right-wing.
Yes.
And corrupt.
Yes. I think we get this would be an interesting aspect to discuss together, how we construct, say, self-images, because obviously for me, I am from Barcelona myself, and that image is, I wouldn't say in my DNA, but it's there. I mean, definitely, I was brought up with a narrative. It's very interesting to see the visions from outside. And you mentioned values, and a value that we, sorry, I use we, a value that Catalan people always have been at the core of a national identity is language, right? So even though your books are more on economics, politics, and the social aspects of history, you both have emphasized and dedicated chapters on Catalan language. So why do you think is central to the conception of being Catalan? First part of the question. And second part of the question perhaps would be for Michael. What do you think are the role of Spanish elites and Catalan elites as well in the question of language?
Spanish elite.
Spanish elites and Catalan as well. I mean, how the elite worked towards the, excuse me, the language question.
Okay, so in a way, if we think about the Assemblea de Catalunya, so like an opposition entity in the early 1970s, had three main slogans, didn't it? Freedom, Statute of Autonomy, and what was it? Amnesty. Yeah. So amnesty for political prisoners. Okay. So the language is clearly central to a construction of Catalan identity, but it's interesting that in those three slogans, it's not mentioned. Okay. And why is it not mentioned? It's not mentioned because the Assemblea de Catalunya was overwhelmingly run, organised, dominated by the Catalan Communist Party. And the Catalan Communist Party felt it had to deal in the conditions of Francoism with a demographic reality which is the transformation of the Catalan population over the course of the 1950s and the 1960s. And from the point of view of the Catalan Communists, it was essential to prevent a division between Spanish speakers who were new arrivals in Catalonia and the rest of the Catalan population. And the mechanism to do that was in a way to kind of like downplay the language and say that the language, we will defend the language, but we will not, if you won't impose the language, it will be something that can slowly transform Catalan society to allow the construction of un poble català, a Catalan people. And it's kind of like, it doesn't matter where you're from, but we're all more or less heading in a kind of unitary direction, okay? So I think that's sort of a very important point. And one of the things that I note in my own book, for example, is some data that 1960 is the last year where a majority of the Catalan population speak Catalan. So it's kind of like been a gradual sort of decline since then. So today, around 35% of self-identify say they most identify with the Catalan language, and 45 to 48% identify with Spanish in the present. Now, what's really important to sort of take that, I think, really is that during late Francoism and into the transition and into the 1980s, we had a very important notion of social mobility, meaning that if you were an immigrant from an Andalusian community and you had an aspiration for your children to potentially advance in Catalan society. And one of the mechanisms that I think is really important to achieve that advance was the Catalan language. So even if you were a person from Andalusia or Extremadura, and maybe you didn't end up learning Catalan yourself and you didn't have the opportunities, but you aspired that your children would learn it because they could socially advance. And I think one of the big issues, and this is happening across the Western world, is more or less the past 10, 15 years to do with developments in global capitalism, if you want, is that social mobility has stagnated, okay? Social mobility has kind of like stalled. It's no longer an active process, which means that many new immigrants from international, global immigrants who arrive in Catalonia now in the past 10, 15 years no longer see the Catalan language as a mechanism of social mobility, okay? They no longer see its utility, they no longer see its importance, they move in a very, very different social terrain. So I think that's kind of like really important. I don't know if I've answered the question in any way, but I think that that's sort of something that's really important.
Very. Yes, no, thank you very much. Very important. Would you like to add something about the police or?
I was thinking about it, I'm not sure.
You don't have to, but.
No, I think it's important to recognise, looking back at the history of Catalonia, that after 1714, when Castilian Spanish became obligatory to be spoken in the courts, in politics, in public, in Catalonia, it was a peasantry and basically a poor class in poor classes in the cities that continued to speak in Catalan. And because the language of power is spoken by the elites, so if you get going way back into the Middle Ages, if you get a king who speaks in Castilian, which began to happen after 1412, then you'll find all sorts of people in the court and people who want to advance and spreading out into the priests, into the middle classes speaking in Castilian. And after 1714 that happened. So the language has become a very central part because there's no racial identity for Catalans. People who speak the language, people who live in Catalonia are able, if they wish, to recognise themselves as Catalans. When I say there's no racial identity, I'm not saying there's no racists, that's another question, but there's no racial identity, but we have this particular DNA, we talk about this a lot, but that doesn't happen in Catalonia. So I think the language is very important because it's been what has been very central to maintaining a Catalan identity. And it is today as well because, it's very, I know dozens of people, you talk to people, get very concerned one way or the other about the decline of Catalan. I don't think necessarily, Andrew was right about social mobility, but there's lots of people who migrate into Catalonia. It's always been a place where people have migrated from because it's on a sort of they pass a corridor between Spain, France, Italy. People come and go and they often settle there. And I've lost my thread in going on about that. I disagree with you. I didn't dare disagree with you about that. Yeah, but I can't remember what I was going to say on that. I'll have to leave that, Elisenda, I'm sorry.
No, that's thank you very much. I think I have time for one last question that we will, I think, resume in a way, and then we can open to the discussion. The final question, it goes back in a way. We talked about myths, but also there are fantasies in our histories, and one constant movement that I've seen in the history of Catalonia is the struggle, right? I mean, it's there, and it's the fighting nature. In a very beautiful paragraph, Michael said that unfortunately Ramon Llull couldn't impose the way his reason to change the course of how history evolved with no conflict. That's obviously a question that I would like to discuss in another occasion. But the question here is, if you think it is true that Catalonia has consistently failed in a way, because its internal divisions in its struggles, and we end with this question.
That sounds a very contemporary question.
Yeah.
I think actually part of the answer to that, I think, goes back to what Michael says, which is like Catalonia, in a way, it's a small country, and it's a small country, most of its history has been between two greater powers, okay? So let's just say that if you're not united, it has a very high cost. If you're a small country and you're not united politically, it has a high cost. I don't think you can be so sort of schematic and say that kind of, Was Catalonia any more divided in the 19th century than other European societies? I'm not really sure. It's very, very more important. So I would attach more importance to say your geopolitical situation. What is your demographic of your economy and things like that? I think internal divisions I wouldn't necessarily consider to be that important, if you want. But they can be something where you can pay a high price if you are a small country. That would be a short reflection on that.
It's a key and essential reflection. So thank you very much for this, and we can.
Does Mike get to answer that one?
You allow me? Princess wants to hurry on. We got time, yeah? No, I'd only say that any society is divided by class. I mean, in one of the things which I've not often, but I have read and heard Spanish nationalists say is as if it was a great accusation. Well, in 1714, the Catalan people was meant to be united in its resistance to the Bourbons, but this is completely untrue because the Catalan ruling class, Catalan merchants were in Mataró, continuing to do business throughout the invasion, throughout the war. That's happened throughout history. When Franco came into Barcelona on January 25th, the people, 26, sorry, Kim, or the 26th, the people who, you were there probably, the people who had been in hiding during the war came out saluting with their arms raised. There's always been class division, as in any society in Catalonia. Where there has been some unity at times is in a particular struggle around 1640 to 1641, a failed revolution, as I would say it was at that time. There was a unity there, and there's been, I think, there was a unity, clearly, a fragile unity, around the recent independence struggle until that was divided. But you can't, no society is united, but you can have an agreement if you want to defend yourself against an invader. Even, I don't think the British society is particularly egalitarian. I think there's a class system, as everyone knows. But when Hitler wants to bomb London, people in the working class and people in the ruling class were prepared, most of them, there were people who weren't, but prepared to defend the country. So that, there's all these divisions.
Thank you. So we can repeat in my question. So now this is the time, your turn to ask Andrew and Michael. Thank you, right?
If I may, I'll just quickly, Andrew, looking through your book, I see I've read it because you haven't actually sold any yet, so there we go. But I noticed it sort of finishes off, but there was a chapter on 2017, the independence movement, etc., etc. And we seem to say, well, it stopped at that particular point, but has it?
Right.
We moved today, and there's this underlying hum, because I know, and we discussed this, we know of personalities in Catalonia who are on trial at the moment for so-called offences, many of them really dubious, and they are facing long prison sentences, long payments of fines. Those trials are still ongoing, and there's still trials yet, prosecutions of mayors who took part in that failed, as it were, independence thing. So that hum of, I'm trying not to use the word repression, but there is something about the Spanish legal system which is pushing against Catalans. You might say, well, it's the law and that's it. Mm-hmm. And I know friends of mine in Catalonia who say, well, that's it, they deserve exactly what they've got. There's others who are completely appalled at what's going on. Mm-hmm. But it's still moving, that's fine.
Is there a question there or such?
Well, yeah, okay. Do you have a comment about this particular aspect of Catalan history, which is still progressing? It doesn't stop in 2017. It's continuing at the moment.
No, absolutely. I mean, I won't I think you've said everything.
Sorry.
I think, no. I think I don't need to repeat what you've just said, but clearly there's a situation of political conflict that is in an ongoing situation, and I don't stop at 2017. I do try to take it up to the early 2020s, but it's not a political intervention to say that clearly the Spanish judiciary, does not act in a kind of like an appropriate manner in a modern European society. That kind of, it's a big issue in Spanish political life, definitely. And it's a highly politicised judiciary, absolutely. One of the things that I say to my students who I teach Spanish history to, in Spain everything is politicised, and the legal system is highly politicised. In a way I kind of struggle with some of it because I come from a British context where kind of like, I've grown up with ultra-conservative judges and kind of reactionary police officers, and the whole British legal system I consider, we just up here, the courts of justice, and so all legal systems tend to be pretty reactionary, pretty conservative, but it's clear that what is currently happening in Spain goes way beyond that culture of conservatism and is engaged in really highly partisan and political interventions into the democratic process. That's not just affecting Catalonia, but it's also concerned with other aspects of Spanish political life, and I think that's a major problem, not just in the case of the Catalans, but it's a major problem for Spanish democracy, however we want to kind of like term that political system. But yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Questions? No?
Hi, Mike talked about the balance of class forces to some extent when he was answering the question about conflict. And in Europe, we've seen the election of Giorgia Meloni in Italy and the rise of the Vox Party in Spain. And I just wondered what comment the speakers would have about how the pressure from the right, if you like, within Spanish society, where the big political establishment parties, historically, when you get that pressure from the right, tend to move to the right themselves as a response. And maybe some of the extreme measures taken against the independence movement come from some of that pressure. And I just think in terms of do you have a comment about that, how that is playing out in terms of the balance of class forces in terms of the struggle further down the line for independence, and how that's affecting it?
When we talked beforehand about this talk, we decided not to talk about 2017 because we knew it would come up, as Jeff has just brought it up.
Sorry.
We knew it would be the theme of the discussion, which is fine, and we're quite happy to talk about that, but we wanted to talk more about history beforehand. Peter's question, I'm not sure how to respond to that, but I think at present, to talk about the PSOE and the Unidas Podemos coalition, I think they are under pressure, obviously, from the right on the national question, on the question of the Spanish state and Catalonia. On other questions, they've reacted against Vox and against the right in a more progressive way, without being especially left-wing, but in a more progressive way. But on Catalonia, it's as it was in the Basque Country with ETA in the past, it's a tremendous vote winner for the right within Spain. So I think Sánchez has been, the Prime Minister Sánchez has been very, I think he's been very able from his point of view in defeating, when I say defeating the independence movements, I think anything can spark it off, it can rise up again. And I think the situation of massive crises crisis in the plural within a Spanish state means it can explode at any moment. But I think he's been skillful in diffusing the issue. Because movements, I mean, any of us who've been in political movements rise and fall, and the independence movement has risen and fallen. What's certain about it is that the 2 million plus people who voted on October the 1st for independence and who are extremely alienated from the Spanish state haven't forgotten that. They might not be going out in the streets, but it hasn't been forgotten, which is why it could come up at any time. And the repression which Jeff talked about, I mean, that's for sure, that's ongoing. I think Sanchez's been skillful. They've used repression for ridiculous things like long jail sentences for blocking a road, for disqualifying mayors for hanging independence flags from town halls, this sort of thing. So I think on the question of Catalonia, you could say yes, they sort of ceded to the right, or they've united with right. One has to remember that the Catalan Civic Society, which was a right-wing coalition which responded to the Catalan independence movement, was strongly supported by the Catalan Socialist Party as well as the Spanish Catalan Socialist Party is part of the Spanish Socialist Party. And to their disgrace, in my view, they went on lengthy parades in Barcelona alongside notorious fascists and small groups. I mean, that was something which the Socialist Party, which came out of a past where it was much more autonomy-based, that even supported self-determination at one stage in the transition. It was a disgraceful shift to the right. In that sense, you're right. Certainly on the national question, it's something which is extremely sensitive, and Sanchez fears, probably quite correctly, that he could lose hundreds of thousands of votes if he's seen as too soft on the Catalan question. Probably someone like Francesc, the delegate of the Catalan government here, could talk about Republicana and the negotiations with Sanchez, which has been part of pacifying Catalonia, but it's not a permanent pacification. But I think they've been quite skillful after the PP have been extremely antagonistic. The Socialist Party has been less so. Ciao.
More questions? I wanted to ask you two questions. One technical, yes, like what drove you to write the general history of Catalonia instead of focusing one century or the later century? And then one about the language being so central for the national identity of Catalonia, and whether that's is similar here with Ireland, even Ireland with Scotland and Wales, and if not, why there is such a difference?
Andrew?
I mean, there's not really any parallels, because I think the Catalan language is quite distinctive in its sort of history of, say, a country that doesn't have a state in the modern period. It's the only example I know of in Europe where people continue to speak the language in the main urban centre, Barcelona. So, you know, the English conquered Ireland and Dublin was rapidly lost and conquered and became English. You know, Scotland, whether you want to include Lowlands, like Scottish Lowlands as a language or not, but like the Gaelic that exists in Scotland, you're talking of tens of thousands right up in the rural communities of Scotland. I work at Cardiff University. You almost hear no Welsh in the city of Cardiff, a city of 340, 350,000. So Welsh is overwhelmingly rural. So Catalan is in a really, and has been, in a really distinctive situation for most of its history, because it maintained itself in the city of Barcelona, it maintained itself in an urban context. And again, you could contrast the situation in Valencia, where the language was mostly lost in the city of Valencia, and it maintained itself in the countryside. As far as I know, there's no other example in that kind of category without a state behind it where it's maintained itself in a really major urban centre. So I think that's really has been pivotal to sort of like the survival of Catalan, because with that you get a kind of cultural infrastructure, you get kind of like intellectuals based in the city, you get status given to the language, and Catalan has never had that association with being a peasant language like Galician or something like that. So I think that's really it's always been strongly associated with modernity, and that sort of has been really important to its survival.
Anything about focusing on 106th century?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I don't know, Laura. I mean, I don't know. I don't know very much about. I mean, the only century I know anything about would be the 20th century, but I mean that's widely written about. So I think more seriously, I think we said this earlier a bit, but the history of Catalonia is to do with explaining Catalonia today. Obviously, there are people who base an independence movement or an autonomous movement. They base it on history, and I think it's important to talk about history to know where present movements are coming from. And the Catalan history, the history of we talked earlier about history of Catalan conquest of parts of the Mediterranean, history of pacting between the Count of Barcelona and the nobles and so on. All this sort of stuff is quite relevant as myths or as facts, depending how you interpret it. So I think we both, in the books, we've been quite careful to talk about how nationalism, whether Spanish nationalism, but particularly Catalan nationalism, because we're talking about Catalonia, has not always been especially fully truthful about its past, so it's been partial about what it's talked about. So I think a history of the 20th century, or would not have, where do you start the 20th century? You can't just, well, I mean, it's where you start anything, but I mean, to go back to the beginning of Catalonia as an entity seemed the logical thing to do.
We have time for a last question.
If we have
Very
time,
much.
okay. I prefer to avoid this.
But
Speaking on the microphone.
you're being recorded.
Oh, right. Well, first of all, apologies for being late. And then second of all, I don't know if you've already talked about that. If you've already talked about this, you don't have to answer. Otherwise, my question is, you've mentioned you think that the Catalan language is a little bit of a particular case. How do you see this is going to evolve in the future? Because what I can tell is that there is a lot of concern on losing this language. So if you've maybe this is you've already thought about it or talk about that. But if you don't, if you can, provide me your opinion, or what do you think the language is going to evolve? Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know, but one of the things which, I mean, I know linguists and so on who talk about the death of Catalan soon, and I also know a linguist who talks about its health and prosperity. So I think what is true is that, I mean, it's part of what Andrew was talking about, a language which it doesn't have a state support, but it has a considerable institutional, very important institutional support. One of the things which has hit me in talking with people is that it's always assumed that the immigrants to Catalonia will always first of all speak Spanish and not Catalan. So I've often listened to or talked with Catalan nationalists who think that the Catalan language is going to die because everyone from Latin America or even everyone from Africa is going to speak Spanish. And that's actually not true. I mean, black workers in the fields of Lleida who are highly exploited, so I'm not saying that they're treated well by their Catalan employers, but what language do they speak? They probably come from a country where, unlike us, they speak 3 or 4 languages anyway in a lot of African countries, and anyway they speak Catalan when they're there. a lot of people, I mean, it's assumed that people from Morocco will speak Arabic. Lots of people from Morocco speak minority languages. People from Bolivia, people from Chile, lots of people speak minority languages. A strong criticism, I think, of a Generalitat. I mean, I've heard this, is how the Catalan Generalitat will put people who don't have Arabic as their language, because they come from Morocco. It's like saying, oh, you come from Spain, then we'll put you into Spanish instead of distinguishing as Catalan. But so we'll talk to people who speak other languages just because they come from a particular nation state will get shoved into that. So I think there's much more variety in people's reaction. I mean, I've talked to lots of Latin America and lots of always saying this, but what I mean is that there are Latin Americans who want to learn Catalan, who will talk Catalan. It's true there's not that specific social mobility associated with it in the transition in the 70s, but I just don't know. I mean, I think linguists are divided on this. I mean, it's true that strong languages eradicate small languages, but there's a very strong Catalan identity around the language, so who knows? What do you think?
Just
answer?
just very, very quickly, I think, just on that, I mean, because there are more people living in Catalonia than ever before, there are actually, like, it depends, there's a mini industry in Catalonia of sociolinguists. It's a massive kind of like cohort of sort of people who work in that field, and you can find whatever evidence you want, in a way, you know?
Yeah.
There are more, in an objective sense, there are more Catalan speakers than ever before, just because there are more Catalans than ever before. So you don't have to be, gloomy, dark and pessimistic, but there are definitely things going on amongst young people. I sort of allude to it really briefly, but I think it's really important that Spanish has really been, or not that it's been planned, but it just so happens that Spanish has kind of like taken over social media and all the platforms that I don't even know what they do. Yeah, the kids, if you want, the 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, they're really pulled into a kind of world of social media, TikTok and all that kind of stuff, and I sound like an old person talking about it. But all these platforms that the teenagers are into, that Spanish is overwhelmingly dominant. So if you want to kind of get any influence, or you want to sort of get your likes and all that sort of stuff, you post in, you're uploading stuff in Spanish. So that's kind of like, something that I don't know how you address that, because I'm far too old to sort of know what you do. But those are the kinds of things that you've got to create living culture that appeals to young people, and I'm not the person who can solve that one, but perhaps the delegate of Catalan government.
Yeah, I'm 25, so I understand.
Organize a conversation about these issues.
So I think big applause. Thank you so much. We're actually going to have one of the conversations about how we're using Catalan in apps, video games, and this is one of the 100 measures that the Catalan government has put forward to actually enhance it in Catalan. So thank you very, very much, everybody. We're very happy this has been the first. We hope to see you again in the coming Catalonia House Conversations. And now we do invite you to come and have a glass of cava with us. Please do remember we have some books in here, and very good evening to everyone. Thank you so much.